If you've prepared yourself for obligatory Smash Brothers jokes, well too bad, cause I'm not gonna make any. Ah, dang it. Anyway, Priam, descendant of Ike the Radiant Hero, is one of the most enigmatic characters in this game. Like I said in the main video, the only hint at this guy's existence before the paralogue came out was his name in the voice acting credits. Other than that, we hadn't seen him before, and nobody had really any idea what to expect from him. Of course, based on his Japanese name Paris, some people did figure out that he probably would have some kind of connection to Ike. Because, and I'll just show a shot of this now, in a very, very, very early build of Path of Radiance, in fact, this screenshot might have been back from when the game was planned to be released for the Nintendo 64. Yeah, there was a Fire Emblem game planned for the N64 that kind of went through development hell and eventually got cancelled. A lot of people speculate that it eventually ended up becoming Path of Radiance. But anyway, in this footage you can see a very early battle screen, but if you look on the right-hand side there, you can see a name that very clearly reads as Parisu if you know Japanese. So that would romanize as Paris, and the character in question is very clearly an early version of Ike. Funnily enough, if you can also read the katakana there, it seems like Paris himself is using a killing edge and the enemy soldier is using a killer lance. The enemy is also called a Deros soldier, so my guess is that was an early version of Dayan, but I'm getting off topic here. Anyway, Priam's name in the Japanese version, Paris, is a direct reference to Ike's name early in development of Path of Radiance. But there's another reason why Priam was so mysterious. For the longest time, nobody had any idea what his growth rates were. In fact, before the playthrough was released, back when I was actually making all of these stat sheets, this was the stat sheet I made for Priam. Because I looked on every single Fire Emblem Wiki resource website I could find. None of them had any information on Priam's growth rates. This was because, for some reason, none of the official guidebooks for this game, which is where they got the growth rates of all the other characters, none of the official guidebooks for this game had any data on Priam at all. And this leads into another interesting thing about Priam. There are hints that he was originally planned to be a DLC character and not included in the main game, which would explain why the guidebooks have no data on him, so both him and his chapter would have originally been DLC. I'm glad they're not, though. So yeah, character we've never seen before, originally planned as DLC, and none of the guidebooks had any info on him. But, through the magic of hacking, we actually do know his growth rates in detail now, so here they are. Somewhat fittingly, Priam is tied with Walhart for the absolute highest strength growth in the entire game. And I've checked, and none of the second generation children can ever have a strength growth that high, so yeah, him and Walhart at 80% are the highest strength growths in the game. Of course, that doesn't actually mean all that much since Priam already starts out with his strength maxed. In fact, he starts out with most of his stats maxed, which is probably why we couldn't really determine his growth rates before, and why nobody really cared about his growth rates, because, well, you're not going to benefit from them all that much since he generally starts out maxed out in nearly everything anyway. But just for completeness sake, I'll show them here. Apart from strength, he's got a good skill growth. His base growth in speed is fairly low, which makes sense if you take into account Ike's appearances in Smash Brothers. And, though in addition to the class growth, his speed, luck, and defense are all the same at 50. Having a 50% defense growth on a hero, though, is pretty amazing. Of course, his weaknesses are in magic and resistance, magic again generally being the dump stat for physical attackers, but that low resistance growth and that -2 cap is going to mean that Priam is very weak to magic. His starting resistance is not all that bad though. As for his modifiers, of course he's got a great modifier in strength and a decent modifier in defense too, and +1 to skill, so really Priam is all about, he's more of a tank-like hero basically, with a neutral cap modifier in speed, which is actually kinda bad by hero standards. But really, yeah, like I said, Priam's growths don't matter too much because he starts out so close to max anyway. It's really his base stats that are the main thing that you want to know about Priam. And on hard mode he starts with strength, skill, and defense all maxed, and with speed almost maxed. On lunatic mode he'll start with nearly everything maxed. So, yeah, and even on normal mode, he starts with most of his stats maxed out, so Priam is really your final reward for clearing the hardest chapter of the game. And that's really the main problem with Priam. If you don't buy the DLC, there's really nothing much left to do by the time you've got him, so, really, he's mostly just for bragging rights. I mean, he's insanely powerful, but again, by the time you finally get him, there's really not much left to do. But I might as well talk about his class and skill options anyway. Now, one really notable thing about Priam when it comes to skills is that he starts out with 3 skills that he would never be able to learn normally. Swordbreaker, Lancebreaker, and Luna. All 3 of these come from classes that Priam has no access to, so those are basically bonus skills, much like Emrin's mage class skills, but even better here, because these 3 are all really, really, really good skills. And in fact, Priam has access to every breaker skill in the game apart from Tomebreaker as a consequence. His starting batch of skills in particular is actually pretty much all you ever need. Swordbreaker, Lancebreaker, Axebreaker, Luna, and Soul. Sadly, Priam doesn't actually have Ike's trademark Ether, but he does have both skills that make it up. And both are pretty powerful. Just remember that, as was demonstrated when we were actually fighting him, Soul has higher priority than Luna, so with it equipped, you'll actually be doing Luna less. And that can be a problem because Luna is a lot of good extra damage. Of course, Soul helps make him a tank, but let's face it, with all of these breaker skills, Priam really works more as a dodge tank than an actual defense tank, though as a defense tank he's not that bad either. Really, Priam's kinda good at just about everything except magic resistance. One flaw though, and this is kind of interesting, due to the fact that Priam starts out with a full loadout of skills already, as I showed in the actual video itself, Priam does not come with both start skills from the Mercenary class. And this is interesting because he's the only pre-promote in the game who does this. You actually will have to demote him to Mercenary if you want Arms Thrift and Patience. And in particular, Arms Thrift is very useful for him because it ensures that Ragnall is back to having pretty much infinite durability like it was in Path of Radiance. Yeah, you don't want to break Ragnall because just like Wildheart's Wolfberg, you can't get another one outside of DLC. Of course, unlike back in Ike's days, anybody can use Ragnall now. It's not just restricted to Priam, and it's a very good sword to give your best sword wielders. So, yeah, it does feel a bit weird not having Priam himself use it, but, yeah, like I said, it's not exclusive to people of Ike's bloodline anymore. As for other skills he has available, getting Bowbreaker from Bow Knight is recommended, because bows are, again, one of the only things that he doesn't have a breaker skill for, and it pretty much leaves him only weak to magic, and, well, Dragonstones and Beaststones, but when he's on your side, you won't be facing anyone with those very often. He also gets Rally Skill there, which is okay in combination with Rally Strength from Warrior, but Priam, really, using Priam as a rally bot is a complete waste of his other talents. Speaking of other talents, from Fighter you can get HP plus 5, which is actually an okay skill because it lets him exceed the HP cap and have 85 HP, and every little bit of HP counts, so that can be quite a useful skill. Zeal, though, is very unlikely to make a difference at this point in the game. Plus 5 critical when most enemies at this point have enough luck to negate that kind of a chance. Not really all that useful. Then, as a warrior, I mentioned Rally Strength before, but he also has Counter. Like I've said earlier, Counter is much more useful for enemies than it is for you, but it can be an alright skill to have. Just bear in mind that enemies that die to Counter do not give experience. Well, actually, it's more like the actual damage from Counter does not give experience. So if you've hit them once with a regular attack and then they die to Counter, you still get the tiny amount of experience that you get from a regular attack, but you don't get the kill bonus. So just bear that in mind. Then again, Priam's not likely to be needing much experience anyway because he starts with almost everything maxed. His final class option is Myrmidon and Swordmaster, which is actually pretty amazing since he learns some even better skills out of these classes. Evasion plus 10 is alright, but Vantage is actually quite useful. Then again, good luck getting Priam reduced down to half health. As a Swordmaster, he'll learn two very useful skills. Astra is great with his skill cap, giving him pretty much a 50% chance of well, 25% chance, but it's still pretty decent. Just bear in mind that if you try and stack Astra's Luna and Soul all at once, only one of them can activate at a time, and Soul will override them generally most of the time, due to Astra's lower success rate. Swordfare is a great skill to learn for Priam because it gives him even more attack power on Ragnall, and that's pretty amazing. And speaking of amazing, as an assassin, Priam will learn lethality. Yeah, as if he wasn't lethal enough already, now he can just instant kill things. And pass, which lets him just run through any enemy meat shields in the way. So, yeah, overall, Priam is pretty ridiculously overpowered, but by the time you get him, there's not very much left to do in the game. If you are taking on the late game DLCs though, Priam can be very, very useful. And now on to voice acting trivia. Priam is voiced by Jamieson Price, who is actually pretty well known within video games. He has done the voices of Iron Tager in the Blaze Blue series, Lu Bu in Dynasty Warriors past the 5th game, Do Not Pursue Priam, Giovanni in Pokemon Origins, and Manlik Caesar, the manliest RPG character of all time in Tales of Graces. Yeah, Manlik is pretty awesome. Much like Richard Epcar, he generally voices deep, booming-voiced hammy characters, but unlike Richard Epcar, Jamieson Price's characters are usually heroic rather than villains, so yeah, hammy hero counterpart to hammy villain voice actor. And that's pretty much all I want to say about the voice acting trivia. It was short because there's actually quite a bit more that I want to talk about Priam. It's time to discuss, something that I had to mention. And so, it's time for the inevitable where did Priam come from conversation. So Priam is a very controversial character within the Fire Emblem fandom, but not really for Priam himself, more for the implications of his very existence. So Priam is a descendant of Ike, and he is specifically mentioned to be in some way a descendant of Ike. Why is this so controversial? Well, the very idea of Ike having a biological descendant is actually kind of implausible, because Ike is in fact the only Fire Emblem main character in the entire series who does not have an epilogue in which they explicitly get married. Yes, Ike is really the only one. Want me to prove it? Okay then, let's do a quick run through. Fire Emblem 1 main character, Marth. He automatically marries Sheeta in Mystery of the Emblem. Fire Emblem 2 main characters, Alm and Celica. They both marry each other in the end of the game. Oh yeah, just a bit of a warning, this rundown may include some slight spoilers. Fire Emblem 4 main character, Sigurd. He automatically gets married to Deirdre, and there's absolutely nothing you can do about that. Part 2's main character, Salif, he can marry any of the second generation girls. Fire Emblem 5's main character, Leif, he automatically marries Nana at the end of the game if she's still alive, and well, her being still alive is canon, just like with Sheeta. Fire Emblem 6 main character, Roy, he can marry various female characters that he gets an A support with. And this is the case for all of the Game Boy Advance main characters. Lynn, Eliwood, Hector, Erica, and Ephraim, all of them have a set list of characters that they can marry if they have an A support with them by the end of the game. Path of Radiance, Ike, he is the exception. Radiant Dawn, Micaiah, she marries Soth by the end of the game if they have an A support. Fire Emblem 11 and 12 are remakes, so I can kind of skip them, and I don't really consider the Avatar from Mystery of the Emblem to really be an actual main character, because they're really not that big a presence in the plot anyway. And Awakening, well, Chrom has to marry someone, as you know, and the Avatar can marry any character of the opposite gender. And Fates, well, the Avatar can once again marry anyone of the opposite gender and even a few people of the same gender, and Azura, if you count her as a main character, can marry any of the first generation males. So yeah, that leaves Ike as the odd one out. He is the only character who does not have a paired ending resulting in marriage. Mainly because in his epilogue in Radiant Dawn, Ike leaves the continent to go wandering in search of other worlds. Now, Ike did have some very vague shipping hints with Elincia in Path of Radiance. However, I've heard that a lot of them were actually added in the localization, and that the Japanese version was not as overt about that. In Radiant Dawn, all hints of Ike and Elincia shipping completely disappeared, so it's pretty obvious to say that Ike probably did not end up with her. Elincia's only paired ending was with Jeffrey. And given that none of Ike's other supports with girls are explicitly romantic at all, that leads to something interesting. Ike's only paired endings in Radiant Dawn are with male characters, namely Soren and Ranulf, where if they have an A support with him by the end of the game, he leaves the continent with them. They accompany him on his journey. Now, normally this doesn't seem like all that much, but with the fact that every single other paired ending in Radiant Dawn is explicitly romantic, as well as the fact that Soren definitely has a lot of homoerotic subtext with Ike, and in fact, this is one of the cases where it's not just fans looking too far into things. It's pretty clear this was intentional, and I'm pretty sure that the affection is definitely canon from at least Soren's side. Because of this has led to a pretty large section of the fandom believing that Ike is gay. And considering the evidence, that is definitely plausible. Because of that, Priam's very existence as a biological descendant of Ike caused a huge fandom uproar. There has, however, been another theory that emerged, though. In Fire Emblem Mystery of the Emblem, you find out that Marth, who has always been called a descendant of the hero Unri, you eventually find out that Unri never had children. He died before he could. The kingdom was succeeded by his brother, and his brother was the one who started the royal line of Altea, which means Marth was in fact descended from Unri's brother and not Unri himself. However, this still worked like Marth was a descendant of Unri to all intents and purposes. He could still use Unri's legendary sword, and everyone still called him a descendant of Unri with no real questions. This has led some people to believe that perhaps the same thing holds true for Priam. Ike has a sister within his own games, Mist. Mist does in fact have a paired ending. She marries Boyd at the end of Radiant Dawn if they have an A support with each other. And so it is actually possible to believe that Priam is in fact descended from Ike through his sister Mist rather than Ike himself. In some ways this does kind of make sense. Fans of this theory also point to the fact that Priam does not have Ether, despite the fact that that the Spot Pass and DLC Ike does have Ether, but he does have Soul, which is a skill that Mist learned. Of course, Soul is a class skill of heroes in this game, and Ether is now basically a class skill of lords, so my guess is that Priam doesn't have Ether for two reasons. One, they wanted to keep Ether within Crom's family during the main story, and two, can you imagine fighting against Priam if he had Ether? Can you seriously imagine how much even harder he would be if he had Ether? Yeah, I don't even want to think about it, so they probably removed Ether from him just for sanity reasons. But anyway, this theory is definitely plausible. Overall though, really, I still don't really like any of this controversy because honestly, to me, Priam neither confirms nor denies anything about Ike's sexuality at all. Ike being homosexual does not completely make it impossible for him to have a biological descendant. I mean, there is always surrogacy. And well, another theory is that Ike could be bisexual, which some people have believed as well. So, there are really a lot of ways to explain Priam's existence, and none of them are 100% confirmed canon. And as such, really, I think we should just stop debating about this. At the end of the day, Priam exists for one reason and one reason alone, because Ike was popular. That's basically it. The developers thought, hey, Ike was really popular, let's have him in this next game. Oh wait, this next game's set thousands and thousands of years after Ike's games, so he probably wouldn't be alive by now. But how can we have someone who's basically exactly the same as Ike, just with a different name? Oh hey, let's have a descendant of Ike. That's probably how this happened. really, you don't want to read too much into this, because again, Priam only exists because Ike was popular. Though there actually might be one more theory, again I'm kind of contradicting myself, not reading too far into this, considering, to avoid spoilers, certain things that happen in Fates with a couple of characters. Another possibility is that Priam is Ike, just with a fake name and having gone through an Outrealm gate. Then again, he has a different voice actor, and, well, completely different personality, so, maybe not so much. One more thing that I want to discuss about this, though. Regardless of where he came from, the fact that Priam is in some fashion a descendant of Ike, or at least the fact that he claims to be one, it actually implies something even more interesting. It implies that Path of Radiance and Radiant Dawn's world, Tellius, exists in the same universe as Arcania and Yggdrasil and Valentia, the ones from Marth, Sigurd, and Alm's games. Originally, Path of Radiance had no connections to any other game in the series, but with this, although, I mean, honestly, okay, you could just say, oh, Ike just went through an Outrealm gate and the worlds aren't connected at all. Well, that makes sense, but then you realise that Pan's supports specifically mention the Lagoos. They don't mention them by name, but it's pretty obvious what they're referring to. Then you have Henry's random event tile quotes, where he says that he saw a man transform into a raven once. It's pretty obvious that Path of Radiance is definitely part of the same world as this one now. Though that raises an interesting question, though. So Awakening is 2,000 years after Marth's games. Yggdrasil, aka Sigurd's game, was 1,000 years before Marth's. Then where does Tellius take place in the timeline? The answer may lie in spell animations for this game. If you pause the game on spell animations of some of the higher ranked tomes, this one here is Valflame, you can see some text. This text is in fact the ancient language from Path of Radiance and Radiant Dawn, the language spoken by the Heron tribe. Now, unlike in Path of Radiance and Radiant Dawn, where every single bit of ancient language actually was perfectly decipherable and made coherent sentences, in fact, the ancient language that was going around the background of the stat screen actually was a quote from Shakespeare's Hamlet, weirdly enough. The ancient language here is complete and utter gibberish. So really, I'm really not sure about using this to actually prove things about the timeline, as most likely the developers just said, hey, we have this ancient language texture, let's just use it here. But if this is to be believed, however, the fact that ancient language from Tellius appears on the spell animation for spells like Valflame, which is a legendary tome from Yggdrasil, which was 1,000 years before Marth's games, that has interesting implications. So the legendary weapons from Genealogy of the Holy War originated from Tellius? That would place Tellius earlier in the timeline than Genealogy. And Genealogy itself is 1,000 years before Marth's games, which are themselves 2,000 years before Awakening. That means that Path of Radiance happened in the very distant past, if it does take place in this universe. And this makes a lot of sense. In the backstory of Path of Radiance, every other continent on the world except Tellius was flooded. So obviously it can't take place in the same time as any of the other Fire Emblem games because, well, their continents wouldn't have existed at the time. So yeah, that makes sense, but yeah, this would put Path of Radiance as one of the earliest games in the Fire Emblem timeline, which I find really interesting. Anyway though, that's enough speculation. This is in fact the last, well, character bio that's done in the main style. I will be doing voice acting trivia for the second generation characters, but I'm not going to be giving them full bios in the same way, because otherwise I'd have to make a separate one for every possible father, and that would take way too long. So, I hope you've enjoyed these character bios. It's been fun making them, and I really hope they've been informative. So, I guess I'll see you in the next playthrough, because I plan to do this kind of thing for most games that I cover, so see you then.